Here you can see a figure that illustrates how the inclusion criteria, you see it says included and excluded studies. So this figure shows how the inclusion criteria work for this particular systematic review. And this is one of the two that I've posted in the class so that you can read them and see the difference between the two types of systematic reviews. We have two examples here, but both of these are public health studies. So up here at the top where it says search strategy employed, basically that means just start here, that the researchers went on to a search engine like either Google Scholar or PubMed, some other kind of search tool, and started with their basic terms, ended up with 191 potential studies for inclusion. Now, that of those 191 studies, here you can see is where some were excluded because of various reasons. It says duplicate studies, N equals 58. And sometimes that just happens in search engines where you can have the same thing listed multiple times, maybe because somebody else reviewed it or it was published something very similar, where the authors just kind of changed the presentation of their findings and published it again in a different journal. So those studies were tossed out. There are 58 of those. And you can see here there's something that says pharmacokinetic titration studies. Those are 7 of them. So because they're studying opioids, they're trying to look at a public health opioid crisis as opposed to a pharmacokinetic study, which is how does the molecular composition of an opioid affect the body. So those would be 2 very different things. So they're excluding studies, you can see, that have that kind of medical component to them. And they ended up having 68 studies left. Now, they don't stop here. They go through and go down to 16 studies in the next group, because then they looked at whether or not studies actually included type of controls that we were talking about in that very first week. We were talking about all the different kinds of studies. You can see here 39 were excluded because they don't have a placebo group. Now, to me, that's kind of a flashing red light. That's important because when you're thinking about opioid crisis and whether or not people use opioids in replacement of other things, a placebo group would be something that you would only find in a randomized control trial. And that's difficult to find in public health. As you can see, it really knocked out quite a few of these studies. And so this issue here about in systematic reviews, if you are only using randomized control trials that include a placebo group, that means you end up not looking at some of those retrospective studies, some other kind of case control studies that would be very important in public health. So that is an issue in the systematic review. Sometimes you really need to make sure to look at these inclusion and exclusion criteria. And then you can see here that they ended up with 2 different types of studies, 13 of one and only 3 of another. And that can happen in a systematic review, that you end up maybe only having a few studies that are meeting your inclusion criteria. And that's one of the ways that you can identify, well, this is a gap in the literature. There isn't enough here to be able to come down on one side or the other. In the other article that I posted in the class, you'll see that only 4 studies end up included at all.